All right, everyone, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Paul Pollack, in celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy, his granddaughter Tikva Esther, and the birth of a grandson, Yosef Menachem. Anonymous sponsorship in the schus of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for all of Klal Yisrael. And Avram and Shane Dikel, in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah, Braina, Bas, Yoshua, Heschel, Zichron L'Bracha. Of course, in Meretz Hashem, we should be zocheh to see the release and the return of our hostages. In Meretz Hashem, b'shalom and b'karov, and may our holy soldiers be successful b'chol ma'asei yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Some really exciting Gemara ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Zayin 17, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Tes Zayin Amud Beis, pretty much like the middle of the daf, the two dots over there. Va'ochel nevelos trefas shkatzim v'ramosim. So literally, punkt the middle of the daf, pretty much right across from Tosas Resake. So the Gemara talks about the following situation. So the Gemara says as follows. Remember again, the Mishnah said that if you eat non-kosher items, nevelos, trefas, shkatzim, v'ramosim, creepy, crawly things, insects, ultimately one will be chayiv malchus. Rabbi Huda. Hayman da'achol bein sod bekarba malkin ale mishum sheretz hashoretz ala aretz. If somebody eats, now bein sod bekarba, Rashi says is tolas hanimtzeis bekruv, a cabbage worm. If one goes in and eats a cabbage worm, ultimately, again, they get malchus because of sheretz hashoretz ala aretz, for eating a creepy, crawly thing that crawls on the earth. Okay? Vahu da'achol bein sod bekarba. The Gemara tells a story. There was a guy who ate a cabbage worm, and what happened to him? The Gemara says, v'nagdei Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda flogged him. Okay, so just like a ma'aseh shehaya, kachaya, the halacha, and then ultimately, again, actually being put into practice. Rabbi said, achol putisa lo ke'arba. If you eat a putisa, Rashi says, bala sheretz hamayim. So putisa is some type of water insect. Water insect, so water creature. If you go ahead and you eat the putisa, then what is that? Lo ke'arba. You get 4 sets of malchus. Now Rashi says over here, why is that? Lo ke'arba. Shnei lavin ksum b'sheretz hamayim. Echa b'toras kohen ve'echa b'mishnah Torah. So first of all, there are 2 lavim, there are 2 prohibitions that are associated, that are written regarding creepy, crawly things from the water. Ushnei lavin ksuvim b'sheretz stam. And then 2 lavin said about stam sheretz. So 2 lavin about sheretz hamayim, water shratzim, and then 2 general lavim. So 4 sets of malchus for this putisa. Better be worth it. Better be worth it. The Gemara says right there, Nimala, what happens if one eats an ant? Loke chamisha, one gets 5 sets of malchus. Why? So mishum sheretz hashoretz ala aretz, right? Ultimately, again, so Rashi points out over here, Nimala, bala nimala chaya, hoil uberia shlema hi achilasa b'choshu, veloke chamish lavin aksuvim b'sheretz stam. So remember again, there's 5 different lavin. There are 2 lavin that are written in association with general shratzim, and then ultimately 3 lavin that are written regarding sheretz haaretz, sheretz that crawls on the ground. Now, remember again, what's the chiddush over here? No, it's not a chiddush. What's the unique thing over here? On a mala, an ant is obviously very small, right? It's not a kizayis. Remember again, what the Mishnah introduced us to is this concept of beria. This concept ultimately again that halacha l'maisa, even if you eat something that is a fully intact living entity, even if it is less than a kizayis, there is still liability. And by the way, you begin to see, not only is there liability, but halacha l'maisa, again, 5-fold liability for the consumption of an ant. Okay? The Gemara goes like this, tzira is a hornet. Lo sheish. So you get 5 malchus, 6 malchus, everything we mentioned, plus mishum sheretz ha'of. There's another lav that has to do with sheretz ha'of, flying shratzim. Okay? I'm Rabbi Yehuda. I'm Rav Achai. So Rabbi say, Hamashen a kavav, if one has to go to the bathroom, and one holds back from going to the bathroom, over mishum bal tishaktu. Now, by the way, why is this coming up over here? Because once we were talking about shratzim and eating disgusting things and sharetz off about them, right, engaging in disgusting practices. So the Gemara also brings this up. So a person has to go to the bathroom and abstains, holds themselves back. They're in violation of below tishaktu. Do not make yourself disgusting. Rabbi Abaye. So good. Rabbi Abaye. Hayman. If we have time, to come back to the halacha. Rabbi Abaye. Hayman deshasi bekarna de'umna. If a person drinks out of the bloodletter's tube, Rashi says over here, karna de'umna makize dam bekara b'mitzitza. So the way you would go ahead and do bloodletting is they'd insert a tube into the patient's arm, right, and then like they'd begin to suck, right. So again, pulls out the blood. If you drink water out of that tube, that's considered to be a disgusting practice. And therefore, one is over on Baal Teshaktu. So we see something interesting, that although, technically speaking, the prohibition of Baal Teshaktu has to do with the consumption of shkatzim v'ramasim, right? It has to do with the consumption of insects, right? Of insects, right? That's the lashon over here, by the way. The lashon over here is v'ivdaltem ben behema atar lebehema latmea ben ha'of atami latar v'lo teshaktu es nafshoseichem. This is really Baal Teshaktu, do not make yourself disgusting, is really a prohibition that is associated with kashrus. Right, with kashrus. Ultimately, again, not going ahead and eating things that are not appropriate for you. The Gemara expands the scope of this prohibition to say you're also not allowed to engage in practices which make yourself disgusting as well. So holding back from going to the bathroom, drinking out of the bloodletter's tube. The Gemara goes like, Amarava, Parafuna, Risek Tishan Amalim, Vehevi Echad Chai, Veshduin Lakizai. So this is an interesting case over here. Let's say you took 9 ants, you smash them up, you mush them up, and then you bring another live ant, and that creates a kezayis of ants. So what's the halacha? Loke vav. You get 6 sets of malchus. Now, before we go on with this, Rashi points out there what's going on over here with the risek. Look at Rashi. Risek mi'ech v'kises ubitlan metoras beria. So remember again, when you go ahead and the whole chap of the ant, right? Why is it that there's liability for ant, even though it's so small? Because it's a beria. Because it is a distinct entity. It's a distinct independent entity. So interestingly enough, that identity as beria only applies when the item is intact. The moment that it is crushed, it loses its beria status. Now, what happens when an ant loses its beria status? What happens? So then it becomes ma'achalas asuros. It just becomes like any other non-kosher item. What's the shear for consumption of non-kosher food? A kizayis. See, interestingly enough, the halacha over here is as follows. So therefore, fascinatingly enough, if you eat a whole intact ant, you chayiv 6 malchus. If you eat a mashed up ant, if it's less than a kizayis, you actually not chayiv anything. I mean, it's not good, you've done an aveira, but there's no liability. To have liability on mashed ants, you'd have to have a kizayis of them. So in this case over here, you have 9 mashed ants. I'm about to say now, the number 9 is not a meaningful number over here. It doesn't matter, 9, 7, 8. The point over here is you have a whole mass of mashed ants, and then ultimately, again, you add in 1 live ant to complete the shear. Now remember, already before we even go on, in this act of consumption, what do you have going on over here? Obviously, there's going to be 2 levels of liability. What are 2 levels of liability? Number one, for the whole ant itself that you're eating, there's going to be independent liability, plus the fact that the whole ant combines with the mashed ants to form a kizayis of ants. So there's that dual liability over here. So that's what we say, lo vav. You'll get 6 sets of malchus. The Gemara says, hemishum beria. So again, 5 malchus just for the whole ant itself. Right? 5 malchus for the whole ant itself. Ve'achamishum kizayis nevela. And ultimately, again, one set of malchus for eating a kizayis of a non-kosher item. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, afilu shnayim. Rav says, by the way, don't think that there's any significance attached to the number 9, right? There's no significance. This would be true even if you had 2 mashed ants and added in 1 live one. Even 1 mashed ant, right? There's 1 big ant, 1 mashed ant, and 1 live ant. Again, everything depends on the size of the ant. But a fascinating idea. So first of all, a number of important takeaways. The din of beria only applies to something that is whole, intact, and alive, right? If it doesn't satisfy those criteria, it's not beria. It's not beria. So therefore, again, a live ant will be chayiv ultimately again for 5 sets of malchus. A mashed ant is ma'achalos asuros and therefore has a shear of kizayis. If you take a mass of mashed ants, combine it with a live ant to create a kizayis, you're going to be chayiv for the beria plus for the kizayis of ma'achalos asuros. So we'll say there's a tremendous musar haskell in this. You look at this, you look at these cases, and what goes through your mind? What goes through your mind? Why would someone do this? Right? This makes absolutely no sense. Right? Really? You can't find something else to eat? I don't know, a piece of kishka? I don't know, it's Erev Shabbos. Like a little tamel. You can't have right to eat. This is what you're doing. You figure out this, it makes no sense. I will say, what's the tremendous Musar Haskell? In general, chet makes no sense. Any avera that we commit, right? In the moment, in the heat of the moment, right? It makes all the sense in the world, right? In the heat of the moment, of course, I would say, in any chet, either after the fact, if I step out of myself and I look at what I did, what often goes through my mind? What was I thinking? Why did I do that? In what world does that make any sense? It's fascinating how, like, in the moment, I can't live without it. But yet, when I step out of myself and look at it, the averos that I commit become no more logical than the consumption of 9 mashed ants with 1 whole ant. The dynamic of chet in general makes no sense. So I will say it's important because I think, like, the next time we're tempted to do an avera, which I don't know, in about 3 minutes from now, I don't know, whenever that next opportunity comes, kind of like if we keep this gemara in our back pocket and realize that every avera is pretty much like this. This is it. This is it. From the grotesque perspective of it, from the unappealing perspective of it, from the nonsensical perspective of it. And if we could just say, okay, this is mamish like eating 9 mashed ants with 1 whole ant. And all of that liability that is going to come, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Perhaps it's a way to reframe and perhaps save ourselves some certain negative behaviors. Incredible. Let's go back to Achol Tevel Meiser. So next, the Mishnah said, if you ate Tevel is untithed produce, and Meiser Rishon, so you get Makkos. You get Makkos, all these cases. So it says the Gemara, Amarav, Ochel Tavel Shal Meiser Rishon, Shal Meiser Ani Loke. So listen to this. Let's say you eat Tevel, right? So Tevel is untithed produce, but let's say in this case, the untithed nature of it is, I didn't separate out Meiser Ani. Okay, so what happens if I don't separate out Meiser Ani? So what's the halacha? Loke, you get Makkos. So both say, so in other words, if I have produce, and the only thing I didn't separate out was Meiser Ani, what the Gemara is saying is that is still called Tevel. That is still called untithed produce, and therefore if you consume it, you're chayiv malchus. Okay, Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Ki haytana. Like the fine time in the Sanya, Rabbi Yossi, Yochalo ye chayiv ela tevel shelo horim mimeno kol ikar. So I might have thought, Rabbi Yossi might have said like this, I might have thought that the only time you're chayiv on Tevel is when you mamish separated nothing from it. Maybe the definition of Tevel is that no tithes have been removed. So the Gemara says, Horim imeno truma gidola, v'lo horim imeno meiser rishon v'lo meiser sheni, v'afilu meiser ani minayin. How do I know that the actual definition of Tevel, Rabbosai, is any produce which has not had all of its tithes removed from it? In other words, Rabbosai, you hear the Havamina? The Havamina is, I might have thought that what is Tevel, what's untithed produce? Produce that has had no tithes attached from it. But as soon as it has some tithes, you're good. You're good. Gemara says, no. How do I know that Tevel really means produce that even if it only has one tithe that has not been taken, even like Meiser Ani, that is still called Tevel. Talmud Omar, lo sucha lechol b'sharecha. Torah says you shall not consume it in your gates. V'alanu Omer, v'achlu b'sharecha v'saveu. So same lashon. Ma lahalod Meiser Ani, just like over there is referring to Meiser Ani. Afkan Meiser Ani, so too over here is Meiser Ani. Lo suchal, and the Torah says you can't eat it. So what do you see from here? That if you have produce, and even all of the necessary tithes were removed, and the only thing that remains to be removed is Meiser Ani, halacha l'maisa, that is still called Tevel. Rabbi Yosef Kitanai. Rabbi Yosef says in reality, this is a machlokes tanaim. What's the machlokes? Or Lazar Omer, Ein tzarich likros as Hashem al Meiser Ani shel demai. So it was very interesting. Remember, let's go back. A couple different ideas over here. D'mai. What's d'mai? I purchased produce from an Amma Aretz. In general, what's the concern when you purchase produce from an Amma Aretz? What's the concern? Did he tithe it? Did he tithe it? So remember again, there's a rabbinic classification called d'mai. D'mai says you have to retithe it. You have to retithe it. So now watch this. Rabbi Loza says like this: I purchase produce from an Amma Aretz. What do I have to do about Meiser Ani? Rabbi Loza says you got to declare it. You have to not declare it, designate it. You have to designate it, right? You have to go ahead and designate Meiser Ani on Demai of an Amma Aretz. The Chum say, top of Yud Zayin, Kore es Hashem ve'eno tzarich lahafresh. The Chachamim say that halacha l'maiso, you have to designate it, but you don't have to separate it. Now that's very interesting. What does that mean? Take a look at Tap Rashi in Yud Zayin 17a. T'chevan shekara alav shem yotza krimi toras tevel ushar meiser ulahafresh al karchach lefi shetzarach lahafresh meiser rishon trumas meiser v'litna lekoyin sheb'misal zarim u'meiser sheni tzarach lalos yushayin le'achol. Suppose listen to this. The Rabbanan say something fascinating. We agree. You have to designate it, but you don't have to separate it. In other words, you can leave it. In other words, you remedy the tevel situation with simple designation, but you do not require separation. So what's going on over here? My love, what are they arguing about? So again, I've got Rabbi Lozer saying, I don't even have to designate it. I have the Chum saying I have to designate it, but I don't have to separate it. What's the machlokes? My love, the mar savar vaday tovlo, umar savar vaday eno tovlo. Maybe the machlokes is like this. Maybe the machlokes will say is in general. Let's say in a definitive case where I know that I have tevel, so does or I should say differently, in a case where I know for sure that I have not separated out Meiser Ani, does the fact that I have not separated out Meiser Ani, does that make the produce tevel or not? Rabbi Lozer would say it doesn't. It doesn't. So Meiser Ani to begin with doesn't make produce tevel, or in other words, the non-removal of Meiser Ani to begin with doesn't make the produce tevel, and therefore when I purchase some in Amma Aretz, there's no need to do anything with this. On the other hand, the Chum say the presence of unremoved Meiser Ani does make the produce tevel, and therefore if I purchase some in Amma Aretz, although I don't have to separate it, I actively have to designate it. Interesting. So the Gemara says, Amar le'Abaye ihachi. If that's the case, ademiflagi b'sveik or liflagi b'vadai. If that's the case, then guys, I shouldn't say guys, Rabbi Lozer, Chachamim, don't argue in a case of D'mai, but rather argue in an actual case. Why don't you just say, I have produce, I have not separated out the Meiser Ani. I've separated out everything else. Is my produce tevel or not? Rabbi Lozer, no. Chachamim, yes. If that's the machlokes, why frame that in a case of D'mai? Frame it in an actual case. The Gemara says, I'm sorry, Ella, the Gemara says, you're right. Let's revisit this. In reality, everyone agrees that the presence of unseparated Meiser Ani absolutely makes the produce into tevel. Everyone agrees with that. So what's the machlokes over here? This is very interesting. Mar savar lo nechshadu ame haaretz al Meiser Ani shel D'mai. Listen to this. So one opinion says that an ani is not chashid, he's not suspect for non-removal of D'mai. Why? Kevan dimamonahu afushi mafresh. Shabbos, listen to this. This is very interesting. What happens, by the way, if you consume your own Meiser Ani? What happens? Right? You separate out Meiser Ani, you consume it. What's the answer? The answer is you didn't do anything. You did something bad, but there's no real ramifications of it. Now, I will say the reason for that is because ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi says, Lo nechshadu, dimamonahu, ein bo israchila, ala gezel aniyim, v'iyu le gezel aniyim lo chayish. So let's listen to this. In general, why don't Amei Haaretz separate out tithes? Why don't they separate out tithes? So it's interesting about saying, we often assume the reason they don't do it is why? Because of a lack of knowledge. They just don't know what to do. That may be true. There's another reason also, which is money. Money. I don't want to separate. If I'm an Amma Aretz, I don't want to separate my money. Right? Giving away tithes means at the end of the day, it's tzedakah, right? At the end of the day, I'm giving something that belongs to me. I'm giving it to someone else. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So what's interesting is the following. When it comes to Meiser Ani, so remember again, Meiser Ani, there's no Isra Achila. Right? In other words, let's say I'm not an Ani, and I eat Meiser Ani. What have I done? I've committed an act of theft, right? As opposed to, let's say, if I eat truma, right? If I a non-Kohen eat truma, that's very serious liability. If I eat Meiser Ani, I've stolen property from the Aniyim. There's not an Isser Achila. There's an Isser Gezel. So therefore, again, one opinion says, Aniyim separate out Meiser Ani. Right? So again, I will say, in this iteration, everyone agrees that the presence of Meiser Ani makes your produce tevel. Right? If you don't separate out Meiser Ani, it's you're eating tevel. Okay, now I'm purchasing produce from an Ama Aretz. There's Demai. Do I have to retithe the Meiser Ani? So here's the machlokes. One opinion says, no, you don't have to retithe. You know why? Ami Haaretz separate out Meiser Ani. Do you know why? Why not? They'll do it. That way they remove any prohibition from their produce. Are they giving the Meiser Ani to the Ani? Probably not. Probably they're keeping it for themselves because it's an Isser Gezel, not an Isser Achila, but that's not my problem. So therefore, again, first opinion says, that's really Rabbi Lazar, that when you buy produce from Amaretz, you could assume that he separated out the Meiser Ani. For Rabbanan Savi, the Rabbanan hold, Kevan de Tricha le Milsa lo mafresh. The Rabbanan say, no. Do you know why an Ani doesn't go ahead and separate out Meiser? Do you know Meiser Ani? Do you know why? Both says they say it's a krich, right? It's a bother. Right? It's a bother. It's tircha. It's extra effort. So what do I need to engage in that for? Why is that necessary? And therefore, ultimately, again, he does not go ahead and separate it out. So we'll say, so what's interesting over here, what's really unfolding over, so again, just understand, just important halacha l'maisa. So halacha l'maisa, number one is presence of unremoved Meiser Ani absolutely makes the produce tevel. That's number one. Number two, interestingly enough, Meiser Ani is not an Isra Achila. In other words, if I eat Meiser Ani, I'm not. It's not like eating something that's prohibited. Rather, again, what am I doing? It's an Isra Gezel. It's an Isra of theft. I'm stealing from the Aniyim. So machlokes, if you buy produce from an Amaretz, do you have to separate out Meiser Ani? Rabbi Lazar says no, because again, Amaretz does it. He probably keeps it, but ultimately he does it. Rabbanan, you do. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, he doesn't do it. Why doesn't he do it? Because he's lazy. Because he doesn't want to be bothered with it. Therefore, again, I have to do it. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. By the way, the way we paskin, the way the Gemara Rambam paskins is if you purchase the mai from an Ama Aretz, you must designate Meiser Ani again. You must designate it. Now again, you don't necessarily have to separate it, right? But you have to designate it. That's the whole idea of mamon she'en lo tovin, not for now. Kam yochal min tevel. So we'll say in general, how much tevel do you have to eat in order to be liable to Makkos? So the answer in the Mishnah was like Kizayis, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Machlokes bechita. Aval bekemach tivrei akol Kizayis. We'll say, so remember again, so Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Shimon the following. So we'll say, if you remember again, was this Mishnah? Okay, so the Mishnah said like this. The Mishnah said, good. Rabbi Shimon says kol. Rabbi Shimon says any amount of tavel, you're liable to Makkos. And the Chacham say a kizayis. So now both say, the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi says in the Rabbi Shimon, machlokes bechita. Right? In other words, the machlokes between a kol and a kizayis, ultimately, again, it's only in a wheat kernel itself. Now again, I will say the reason we're going to see that is because halacha l'maisa, in the wheat kernel case, that's where Rabbi Shimon will say that's a beria. However, again, the Gemara says, aval bekemach tivrei akol kizayis. When it comes to, let's say, flour, right? Let's say you're consuming flour of tevel, everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa, you need a kizayis in order to be chayiv. Okay, Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Shimon Lakish, ki machlokes bezu, kach machlokes bezu. Right? Rabbi Lakish says no, it's machlokes both cases, both in chita as well as kemach. I will say first wide line. Tanan, Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said to the Chachamim, iatem modim li ba'ochal namala kol shu chayiv. So Rabbi Shimon, remember Rabbi Shimon holds that by tevel a kol shu, any amount you're chayiv. So he says to Chacham, I don't understand. Don't you agree that in the case of the ant, in the case of the namala, that even if you consume any amount, you're going to be chayiv? They said, yes, that's because that's a beria. Right? Ultimately, again, that's how it was created. That is a complete unit in and of itself. So to a wheat kernel. A wheat kernel is also a beria. Right? And therefore, again, there should be liability for consuming that. So when it says chita in kemachlo, what do you see from here? The machlok is only by a kernel of wheat. But everyone agrees that if you were to consume flour of if you were to consume flour of tevel, that you certainly would need a kizayis. Say, perhaps this is Rabbi Shimon saying to Chachamim. Rabbi Shimon said like this. According to me, even a kosher of kemach ultimately again should create liability. But you Rabbanan, even though you're going to disagree in the case of flour, at least agree with me in the case of the wheat kernel. Right? At least in the case of the wheat kernel, agree with me that halacha l'maisa, there will be liability even for one wheat kernel because it is a beria. The Rabbanan will say no. Berias neshama chashuva, chita lo chashuva. And as just mentioned before, beria, the definition of beria, will say, is not only something that is a complete entity, it is something that is a complete entity and living. A living complete entity ultimately again is a beria. Which I will say, by the way, now just so you understand, remember again previously in the case of Nimala, right, in the case of an ant, Rashi said, that what was the case of the ant? Rashi said, Bala Nimala Chaya. In order to be chayiv for consuming, right, an ant, right, all those different prohibitions, a beria has to be alive. If you have a dead ant, so a dead ant is then ma'achalos asuros. That's non-kosher food, and then the shear for that is a kizayis. So the Rabbanan say back to Rabbi Shimon, I hear what you're saying. A wheat kernel, you're right. It is a natural forming complete entity. It's not living. Because it's not living, it doesn't have the status of beria. Beria is the shema chashuva, chitol chashuva. Tanya Kava say, Rabbi Shimon Omer koshu Makkos, Omer kizayis el inyan carbon. So okay, so this brayso supports Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Rabbi Shimon says, any amount of consumption gives you malchus. We only say kizayis for carbonic purposes. So I will say, so again, halacha l'maisa, the way we paskin is essentially there's two shiurim. There's shiur of beria, which is if you have a fully intact living entity, even if it's tiny like an ant, there will be liability. But for every other act of consumption, the shear is going to be a kizayis. Okay, incredible. Mishnah. Well, so let's go. Now, the nice part about this Mishnah is actually we've seen a number of these cases already. Ha'ochel bikurim achlo karu aleim. So also remember again that is alocha. When you bring bikurim to the Beis Hamikdash, halavai we should be zochem eretz Hashem bekarov. So there is mikra bikurim. There's a whole recitation, right? Arami overavi. We just said in the Haggadah, right? Pretty much so much of Magid ultimately again is mikra bikurim. Another Pesach, again, it's going to get even better in just a second. I'll say it really is like, all kidding aside. Okay, you could accuse me of like making up a lot of stuff, right? This is not me. Like I'm not making this up. This is really incredible. So in any event, so what happens? I go ahead and eat it, right? Or the Kohen eats the bikurim before the recitation is done. Or Kachek Hadashim Chutz L'Kilayim, or you Kachek Hadashim outside of the curtains. I will say, now remember, curtains is a reference ultimately to the Mishkan, right? Rashi says, Osha'achol Kachek Hadashim Bizman Mishkan Chutz L'Kilayim. So I'll say, now in the Beis Hamikdash, you just replace the word curtains with walls. Walls outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. Or Kachim Kalim U'Maiser Sheni Chutz L'Choma, or Kachim Kalim U'Maiser Sheni outside of the wall of Yerushalayim. Right, so both say so again. We're going to see all of these are karis bearing, malchus bearing violations. Or hashover as ha'etzem bepesach hatar. Again, I will say Karim Pesach, incredible. Hashover as ha'etzem bepesach hatar, or ultimately one who breaks a bone in a carbon Pesach. And again, with this Pesach, we're going to see there's a prohibition of etzem lo sishbaru bo. You're not allowed to break a bone when eating the carbon Pesach, but that obviously only applies to a Pesach that is tahar. So if one goes in and breaks a bone in a Pesach that's tahar, all of these cases, Rabbi say, hare ze lo ke'arboim. In all of these cases, all of these aforementioned cases, halacha l'maisa, you get malchus. However, aval, hamosir b'tar, if you leave over from a carbon Pesach, no, sir, or a shover betame, or you break a bone in a carbon Pesach that is tame, you do not get malchus. Okay, hanotel emalabanim, because we literally just had this case. Shiluach hakan, right? So again, I'm supposed to send away the mother birds before I take the chicks or before I take the eggs, but I violated, and instead I went ahead and I took the chicks or the eggs without sending away the mother bird. So I'll say, Rabbi Huda Omer, loke ve'inu mishalech. Rabbi Huda says, sorry, you missed the asay. You missed the assay, and because you missed the assay, you'll get Makkos for violation, and there's no way to make it up. The Chachamim say, Mishaleach ve'ena loke. The Chachamim say, ultimately, again, you could send away the mother bird, and ultimately, again, in other words, you could now go ahead and send away the mother bird and avoid the Makkos. Now, we'll say, so again, just want to point out something very interesting. Let's finish with the Mishnah. Zeh klal kol mitzvos lo saseh sheyish ba kol maseh ein chayal. We'll say literally yesterday's daf. This is literally what we spent the bulk of yesterday doing. And there was a quote from this Mishnah. The Mishnah says, this is the rule. Any mitzvahs lo saseh, any prohibition that has an associated aseh, an associated positive commandment, ein chayavin aleha, which seems to indicate, what are we talking about up here? There's a lot of hanitak la'aseh. Now, both I want to point out over here, and we already saw this in yesterday's daf, that remember that halacha l'maisa, when it comes to shiluach hakan, there's a fundamental machlokes about how to interpret those psukim. Right? Why? Because the way the pasuk reads is like this, right? Ki karcha kan separ la derech, va'im rovetzes alabanim, lo sika ha'im alabanim. Do not take the chicks while the mother is there. Shaleach tishalach es ha'im. Send away the mother. Now, what's unique about that case? What's unique about the case? The case is that the asay is actually mentioned after the lav. Right? And then it says shaleach tishalach es ha'im, right? Vesabanim tikach lach. So in other words, it says, don't take the chicks when the mother is there. Send away the mother and take the chicks. So there's a fundamental machlokes as to how to understand that case. Rabbi Yehuda says, essentially, the assay only applies in the beginning. In other words, send away the mother, take the chicks. If you take the chicks and you didn't send away the mother, there's no makeup for that. The Chachamim, on the other hand, understand that no. The way that it's phrased in the Torah is essentially, there's two opportunities to perform the assay. What are the two opportunities? Opportunity one is before you take the chicks, right? And opportunity number two is after you take the chicks. So again, I just want to point out, although this case is here, it's interesting that that case has its own machlokes associated with it. Then there's a klal that everyone agrees with. What's the klal? The klal is lavanitak laseh. That if you have a low saseh, right? If you have a low saseh, ultimately again, and that low assay could be remedied by an assay, you don't get Makkos for that. Again, then Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish loom in the background, right? How long do you have to perform the assay? Okay, that's a separate discussion. But I just want to point out that although Shiluach HaKan is being mentioned over here, Shiluach HaKan really has its own complications in terms of how to interpret that mitzvah. Okay, here we go. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yochanan. Zudiv Rabbi Akiva Stimsoi. So these are the words of Rabbi Akiva Stimsoi. The Gemara says, however, Aval Chachamim Omrim Bikurim Hanocha Ma'akeves Bain Kriya Ein Ma'akeves Bain. So this idea, this halacha in the Mishnah, that if you go ahead and the Kohen eats Bikurim before the Mikra Bikurim, he gets Malchus. Whose opinion is that? That's Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva ultimately again holds that halacha l'maisa Kriya is Ma'akev. Kriya is necessary. Just want to point out that the Chachamim say by Bikurim the Kriya is not Ma'akev. What is Ma'akev? Hanocha. Placement before the Mizbeach. So if you don't place before the Mizbeach, you have a problem. But if for some reason you omitted the reading, you're fine. You're fine, not ideal, but you're fine. Valema Zudir Shimon Stimsoi. But why not go ahead and attribute it to Rabbi Shimon? You're right. Just also telling us to Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Shimon. Who's Rabbi Shimon? My Rabbi Shimon. The sign Rabbi said this is fascinating. Rabbi said, by the way, this is so good. What's the Rabbi Shimon? Here we go. Rabbi said this is a fascinating drasha. Fascinating drasha. So let me just give you the pasuk in its entirety. If you happen to have the pasuk if you have the Torah or in your Gemara, you can see the pasuk in the margin. Lo sucha lecho b'sharecha. Here's the pasuk. You cannot eat within your gates the following foods. Masar de gancha v'siroshcha v'yisarecha. We're going to interpret what each of these means. Bechoros bekarecha v'tzonecha. V'chol nedarecha sher tidar. V'nidvosecha utrumas yadecha. So these are all the items that cannot be eaten in your home, have to be eaten in Yerushalayim. Now, within this list, there are different things that need to be consumed in different places in Yerushalayim. So here we go, boss. Get ready for this. Now, Rabbi Shimon, that is fascinating. Darshans the pasuk backwards. He darshans it backwards. So watch this. Tisanya utrumas yadcha. What does that refer to? It'll be Bikurim. This refers to Bikurim. Rabbi Shimon, ma bazel lamdenu. What is this pasuk coming to teach us? Im la'achlan chutz l'choma. If it's telling me that I can't eat Bikurim outside of the wall of Yerushalayim, that's obvious. Kal v'chomer meiser sheni akal. I can make a kal v'chor meiser sheni. Meiser sheni, which is more lenient than bikurim, right? More kal than bikurim, can't be consumed outside of Yerushalayim. Certainly can't consume bikurim outside of Yerushalayim either. Uma meiser hakal oklon chutz lechoma loke bikurim lakosha. If meiser sheni, which is more lenient, if you eat outside of Yerushalayim, you get Makkos. All the more, so you can't eat bikurim outside of Yerushalayim. So what is the pasuk coming to teach me? Halaba akasav ella la'ochel me bikurim ad shelo kara aleim shu loke. What is the pasuk coming to teach me? That Allah Chalamaysa, if the Kohen consumes the Bikurim before the recitation, you get Makkos. Good. That's drasha number 1 from a Trumas Yadcha. Next, V'nid Vosecha. What is this referring to? Zu Toda Ushlamim. This refers to a Toda, a thanksgiving offering, Shlamim. Rabbi Shimon, Ma ba denu. What is this coming to teach us? Im la'achlan chutz lechoma. If it's coming to say that I'm not allowed to eat it outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, that's obvious. Kavachomer mi meiser. Then I can make a kavachomer from meiser sheni. Ha lo ba kasav ella lo ochel betodo b'shlom lefnei zrika shehu loke. It's coming to teach you that if I eat from a toda or a shlomim before zrika, that I get Makkos. Incredible. Next, ubechoros. Zah. What does Bechoros refer to? That's a Bechor offering. Rabbi Shimon, Ma Bazela Amdenu. What is this coming to teach us? Im la'achlon chutz l'choma kavachon meiser. If it's coming to teach you that I can't eat it outside of the wall of Yerushalayim, that's obvious. That's obvious. That's a kavachomer from meiser sheni. Im lifnei zrika. If I'm not allowed to eat it before zrika, kavachomer mi toda ushlamim. Then ultimately, again, that's a kavachomer from toda and shlamim. Ha lo ba'akasav ella. So that's talking about over here that if a non-Kohen eats from the Bechar, even after Zrika, he gets Makkos. Incredible. What is this coming to teach me? Zu chatos va'asham. This refers to a chatos and asham. What is this coming to teach us? If it's coming to say I can't eat outside the walls of Yerushalayim, kavachomer meiser sheni. That's already kavachomer from meiser sheni. Im lifnei zrika kavachomer mitras. So once you hear all of these drushes are building on each other. If it's to tell me that I can't eat it before zrika, that's kavachomer told shlamim. Im la'achar zrika kavachomer b'char. So what is it coming to teach me? Ha lo ba kasav ela la'ochel mechatas va'asham afilu la'achar zrika chutz l'kilayim shu loke. It's coming to teach me for a Kohen that if a Kohen goes and eats from the Chatas and the Asham even after Zrika, but outside of the curtains, outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, you get Makkos. Next, Nidarecha Zu Ola. Nidarecha refers to an Ola offering. Rabbi Shimon, Ma ba zet lelamdenu. What is this coming to teach us? Im la'achlan chutz l'choma. If it's saying that I can't eat it outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, so kavachomer mi meiser. Then it's kavachomer meiser sheni. Im lifnei zrika kavachomer mi toda shlamim. If before zrika kavachomer toda shlamim. Im la'achar zrika. If you can't consume it after zrika kavachomer mi bechar. I will say, man, all these drushes building on each other. Im chutz l'kilayim. If it's outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, kavachomer mi chatas va'asham. So what is it coming to teach me? Ha lo ba kasav amad beis ela la'ochel min ha'ola la'achar zrika afilu bifnim shu loke. Rather, what is coming to teach me? That I must remember again, an ola is totally consumed on the mizbeach. So what's the drasha? The drasha is coming to teach me that if a Kohen eats from the ola, even after zrika, even inside of the Beis Hamikdash, that what? That you get Makkos. Rabbi say this is a brilliant exposition. Look what Rabbi Shimon just did. First of all, he dashed in the pasuk from the end, right? What we call meseifei l'tchila, from the end to the beginning, and each drasha successively built on the other. So let's listen to this. Amar Rava. So Rava was blown away by this drasha, and therefore Rava says, "Tiyalde ime ki Rabbi Shimon teleit." If a mother is going to have a child like Rabbi Shimon, it's worth it to have a child. V'ilo, but if your kid's not going to be like Rabbi Shimon, lo seleid. Better not to have a kid. Okay, so all right, that requires a bit of explanation over here. So it says, so first of all, I just want to point out something very interesting. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, Diyalde imek Rabbi Shimon teleit, third line down from top of Rashi, Kol imo yoledes tivakish rachamim yiratzon sheyehe Rabbi Shimon. Right, that literally again, what Rav is saying is that when a mother is pregnant, or even after she gives birth, she has a baby, she should always daven for her child. My son should be like Rabbi Shimon. Now, I just want to point out, if you have in your Gemara the Hagos V'tziyunim, and you see the little Os Aleph over there, if you'll notice, he says, Ayin Ritva, de lo garsinan tevos, v'i lo selid. many editions of the Gemara don't have that last phrase. They have the first part of the phrase, but not the last part of the phrase. In other words, they have the statement, Tiyolde ime Reb Shimon teleit, right? A mother should daven for a child to be like Rabbi Shimon. But ultimately, again, that last part is stricken. First of all, it doesn't seem to be like a logical statement, because not everybody's like Reb Shimon, right? There are many great people who are not like Reb Shimon. There are many people who are greater than Reb Shimon. So, like, what does that mean? That this, in Yiddishkeit, it was one of the most beautiful things in Yiddishkeit, although we often forget this idea, is that there is no one model of successful Jew, right? There's no box that a successful Jew looks like this. That's the beauty and the power of our people, that a successful and holy Jew looks so many different ways. So to say that this is the picture of success would seem to be antithetical to the totality of Yiddishkeit. That being said, what Rav is saying, according to the Ritva, he also quotes over here the Aruch Laner, is that a mother should daven for her son to be like Rabbi Shimon. And I just have to tell you something absolutely amazing. Something absolutely amazing. You know, we've been having these constant Pesach references over and over and over. I will say the Rabbi Shimon that is being referred to over here, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So amazingly enough, many of the Svarim write that this Gemara is the Makar for doing upsharon in Meron by Rashbi. Right? Why do we take little boys to have their haircuts by Rashbi and Meron? It's based on this Gemara. It's based on this Gemara. You bring your son to Rashbi, you bring your child to Rashbi, ultimately, again, in line with what Rav said, Diyal di'ime ki Rabbi Shimon yalad. Every parent should daven that their child should be like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We bring our children, again, as they enter into Gil Mitzvahs, because the whole chap of upsharon, beautiful minhag, right? The whole chap of upsharon is ultimately, again, it's the performance of a mitzvah, the mitzvah of peyos. So ultimately, again, we bring our children to Rashbi in fulfillment, ultimately, again, in fulfillment of our Rabbi Shimon. I will say, there's so much to say about this, about like, and I just want to point out how beautiful this is, right? Just look what just happened in the Gemara over here, right? Constant Pesach references, including two in the Mishnah, right? Arami, Oved, Avi, Mikra, Bikurim, Haggadah, once again, Karban Pesach, and now ultimately again, a reference to Lag BaOmer, reference to Sirah. So how incredible is it? I will say that, you know, life is this constant push and pull. Sometimes when you have a beautiful experience in life, what you want more than anything is just to remain there, right? I don't want to leave. Like the Arizal brings down, he says, why is it that people cry at happy events? Right? It makes no sense, right? Tears are so often more associated with pain, with sadness. Why do people cry at happy events? The Ari HaKadosh says, because deep down the neshama wants more than anything to hold on to this moment. I just want to hold on to it. I don't want it to go. But the neshama knows it's going to flee. It's fleeting. It just escapes. And that's why, again, there's tears. So sometimes we have a beautiful, holy moment. We just want to stay there. But, you know, the avodah in life is keep moving ourselves forward. So on one hand, our beautiful Gemara, our beautiful Dap has been keeping us tethered in Pesach, because Pesach is mamish, zman, you know, zman cherus, same with zman geula, same with chayiv adam liros taskiyotzim in Mitzrayim, a cherus, a feeling of freedom, a feeling of personal emancipatory power. But at the same time, now the Gemara says, got to move forward. Moving towards Lag BaOmer, we're moving towards Shuas, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Incredible. V'yafagav, says the Gemara. V'yafagav, v'islay pirchei. Now, even though, by the way, I also want to point out, just so you should think about it a little bit, it's fascinating, by the way, that the Gemara attributes this tefillah ultimately to the mother. Right, this is the mother's tefillah, right? It's the mother should daven. Now, obviously, on the most basic level, right, because the mother is giving birth, right? That's what it's associating with. But it's also, I will say, there is so much about the personality of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which is, right, again, we have to, if I have time at the end of this year, which I definitely will not, but right, we'll put it on our list, but why Rashbi? So again, Rava is obviously astounded just by like the lumbus of Rashbi. There's so much about the personality of Rashbi that we want in our own children. Okay, V'yafagav, Dislei Pircha. So we'll say, the Gemara says, by the way, I just want to point out, you would think after Rava's praise of Rashbi, that Rashbi's limud is correct. So I want to point out, by the way, Rashbi, his limud is actually flawed. His limud is flawed, right? The whole drasha is flawed. Why? Because there's a pircha. Then we'll say, what's the pircha? Here we go. My churma de bikurim meiser shekain asrum lezarim. So we'll say again, why did we say that bikurim is more chamer than meiser? Because ultimately, again, meiser sheni can be consumed by anyone. Bikurim can't be consumed by non-kohanim. Adrabah, I can say Meiser Chamar Shekein Asr Leonin. I can say just the opposite. Bikurim can be consumed by an onen. Meiser Sheni can't be consumed by an onen. So in that case, again, we kind of just blew a hole in Rashbi's Kal V'chomer. Umay Chumra the Toda Shlomim Meiser. What's the Chumra of Toda and Shlomim from Meiser Sheni? Shekein Tu'unan Matan Damim Ve'mur L'gam Mizbeach. Remember again, Toda and Shlomim have sacrificial rights on the Mizbeach. You have to do blood applications. The Kishkas on the Mizbeach. Adrabah, Meiser Chamer, Shekein Tu'unin Kesef Tzura. Meiser could be Chamer, why? Because again, remember, I will say, you can redeem Karbanos, but ultimately on anything. Meiser Sheni, if you want to redeem it, it requires minted coinage. That's a Chumrah. So as I said, remember again, essentially what the Gemara is showing over here is that Reb Shimon's logic really was flawed. Like, in other words, it was a brilliant exposition, but at the end of the day, it's wrong. It's wrong. What was the chumrah of Bechor of Atodah Shlamim, or what was the supposed chumrah? Shekin Kiddusha Samirechem. That Bechor ultimately is consecrated from the womb. Adrabah, Todu Shlamim Chamurim, Todu Shlamim or Chamur, why? Shekin Tu'unin Smicha, Unisachim, Utinufas Chazeh V'Shok. Because ultimately, Toda and Shlamim require smicha, which is leaning on the animal, Nisachim, wine libations, and the waving of the chest and the thigh. Umay Chumra de Chatas V'Asham B'Char. And what's the Chumra of Chatas and Asham over B'Char? Shekin Kachei Kadoshim. Because they're Kachei Kadoshim. Adrabah. B'Char Chamer, I would say that B'Char is Chamer. Why? Shekin Kiddusha Samirechem. It is sanctified from the womb. Umay Chumra de Ola Mechatas V'Asham. What's the Chumra of Ola over Chatas and Asham? Shekin Kalil. It's totally consumed on the Mizbeach. I would say Adrabah. Chatas V'Asham Chamiri Shekin Mechapri. They affect atonement. The Kulu Chamiri Ma'ola. This Bushtei Achilos. And ultimately, again, everyone is more Chamer than Ola. Why? Because Ola has two consumptions. Now remember again, I will say, because I'm saying the Isbush de Achilos. Ultimately, again, I'm sorry, because all the other Karbanos have two Achilos, have two consumptions. In other words, either Mizbeach and Kohanim, owners Kohanim, whereas Ola ultimately, again, only has consumption on the Mizbeach itself. So I will say, so therefore, again, the Gemara says, by the way, it was a brilliant exposition, absolutely brilliant. Only one problem. It was incorrect. Just a slight detail. I think Gemara says, if that's the case, so why the overwhelming praise for Rabbi Shimon? Elamai diyal de'imei Rabbi Shimon. So Rava, you would think that after that kind of praise, that every mother should daven for her son to be like Rabbi Shimon, that Rabbi Shimon's drasha would be correct. But yet it's incorrect. So why did Rava say daven for your child to be like Rabbi Shimon? The Rava says incredible. Dilamai desfira leila didei, misaris leila kra v'darish lei. Because Rabbi say the drasha itself was overwhelming. In other words, you're right. Rabbi say sometimes the result is wrong, but the process is so incredibly profound. What Rabbi Shimon did, the drasha, and I will say, by the way, it's not just a drasha, it's a reverse drasha, right? It's a drasha ultimately, again, from the end of the pasuk to the beginning of the pasuk. So the drasha is incredible. The reverse kite of the drasha is absolutely incredible. Everything is incredible about this, which I will say tells you something absolutely amazing. What Rava was extolling was as follows. Did Rabbi Shimon come up with the right conclusion? No. But I will say, but what did he do? He put in a Herculean amount of effort. And at the end of the day, what makes great people great are not necessarily the results that they produce, but rather the effort they are willing to expend to get to that finish line. And I will say that was the life of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai again lost so much. He lost so much time. Again, remember he was in hiding for an extended amount of time. But Lamai said during that time, what he made of himself, sometimes the results don't materialize as you had intended for them to. But the process itself is really where our personal prowess, our energy, our abilities really comes out. So that's what Rava was extolling. The conclusion is wrong, but the process is so profound. Every mother should daven to have a child who is committed to the process. Because Rabbi said, we know at the end of the day, we don't control the results. We often don't control the outcome. The only thing we control is how much effort we are willing to put into the process. Who personifies that willingness to put effort into the process? Rashbi. And therefore every mother should daven for a child to possess this koach. So we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron, Zoom, have a wonderful good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos.